Hi folks, my name's Darren and I wanted to kitbash Ezekiel. With this kitbash I used three main kits. The first one being Mephiston, the second one being a Librarian and Phobos armour, and the third one being a bit more difficult to get hold of, but the Primaris Company Champion. Getting straight into it, the first thing I did was remove all the key components from Mephiston, bar the cloak. I removed any sprue tabs, as I normally do, and I cleaned up any mould lines using my knife. Oh yeah, and I removed the scenic base display, ready for defacing later. While I got a free minute, thank you very much for everyone who's subscribed and commented so far on the previous videos. I've had amazing response with it, and I really appreciate all the feedback and all the positivity, so thank you. Using my hobby saw, I eviscerate Mephiston in half, separating the torso from the bottom part of the model. I keep the top half aside as I'm going to be using the Librarian skulls on top of his collar for something a bit later on. But the main part we need is that robed bottom half. Next up, I removed the front half of the Librarian Phobos armour from the sprue, and again I cleaned up all the mould lines and removed any sprue tabs. I also gently teased the keys and parchment away from the main part of the body, just to make it a bit easier for later on. And like a man possessed, I started hacking away and removing all the rest of the robes from the model, just leaving the belt and the upper torso on its own. This bit's not for the faint-hearted. It's just once you do this, you can't go back. I'd also made sure to compare what I had left against the bottom half of the Mephiston model, and making any adjustments that I needed, if I needed to do so. And I did. I needed to take a little bit more off to ensure that the top half of the torso fit flushly against the bottom half. And then using my hobby knife and a sanding stick, I removed the muscular embellishment on his little weird, I can only describe it as a codpiece I guess. I then removed the back half of the Librarian and Phobos armour and tidied it up. This next bit is definitely murder. I do murder this model, but in a good way. Again, grabbing my clippers, I chopped away at most of the lower half of the model, making sure I kept the gun in its holster and the belt. Just hacked it like a madman. And once again, comparing the upper half to the lower half, I realised I needed to take a little bit more off the bottom half so that it would fit nice and flush. There's that old adage, isn't there? Measure twice, cut once. Same sort of thing really here, you kind of compare it and then cut it back. So don't cut too much off because you can never put it back, however you can always take more away. There you go, philosophical. After that deep, meaningful discussion, I used my hobby saw to remove the shoulder pad from the upper half of the Librarian torso, and cleaned it up so it kind of blended in with the rest of the model. Once I was happy with how it was turning out, I glued the front half and the back half of the torso together. I was slightly unhappy with the way that the bottom half was sitting against the top half, so what I did is I went to extreme measures and used a bit of sandpaper. I didn't do too much because sandpaper is harsh and it will rip it to shreds, but I just took my time and just took enough off so I was happy with the end result. I didn't show the previous bit, but what I'd done is I'd used my sprue goo to fill in the gap that was left when I joined the pieces of the bottom half together. I let that dry and then I used a sanding stick just to smooth it down a little bit more. Murder number 2, or was it number 3? Anyway, who's counting? This bit is probably a little bit crazy, if I'm honest, in hindsight and all that. However, all I needed from this company champion was the arm, or part of the arm, that was attached to his torso. So I did what I needed to do, which is remove him from the sprue, clean everything up in anticipation for some minor surgery. And here is that minor surgery. I cut away most of the torso around the arm and then finally chipped away at the plastic so that all I was left with was a bloody stump. Again, after any cutting, I made sure to compare it against the place I was actually going to stick it to make sure it fit perfectly. It did require some finagling. I was a little bit in an iron whether it was going to work, but you'll see. Next up, I removed the remaining arm pieces from the company champion sprue, did the needful, cleaned up the mould lines and removed the sprue tabs. Do I need to keep saying that? Let me know in the comments below if I do or don't. Now, it wouldn't be one of my videos if at some point I didn't think, you know what, this ain't working. And this is another one of those moments. And I'm not just saying that because people like the fact that I mentioned it. This is true. This bit was so fiddly. I got so frustrated with it. My fingers were all in the way. The blue tack wasn't working properly. I couldn't position it in the correct way that I wanted it to be. Very frustrated. But once again, I went away, it came back, had another crack, and I was good to go. Once I was happy with the position and I was happy that it was actually going to work, thank God, I then removed the little stub that was left on the torso from the librarian so that the arms could fit flush against it. Again, I constantly compared what I was doing against the bits I had to ensure that they fit nicely together. And then I removed the arm that was holding the power sword from the librarian in Phobos armour. All I needed here was the blade, so I was just going to cut it out and remove the blade from the hilt. With my hobby knife, I managed to remove the sword, and with a combination of my clippers and my knife, I tidied up any rough edges. I followed this up by removing the power sword from the company champion's hands. Word of advice here, folks, that I did not listen to is if you can pin these awkward parts, pin them. I learnt the hard way when I was painting this model, as my little finger managed to catch the sword and ping it flying across the room. And with some final alterations, I was happy enough that the pieces would go together nicely. But like I said, pin it. If you can, pin it. Next up, I glued the arms to the torso, and my god, this was fiddly again. I didn't step away this time, I was determined to get it. So I did it in stages. I first attached the full arm with the shoulder pad and the right arm that was holding the hilt of the sword together, stuck that first, and then the small little bloodied stump, I attached that after. The end result was a bit frustrating as the blade was a bit higher up than I wanted it to be, but I think it gives a bit more of an imposing look, like he's about to come down to strike you with his power sword. I was then at a point where I could commit and glue the top half of the body to the lower half of the body. There is a noticeable gap at the back, as you can probably see. However, what I do is I clip the tome from the Librarian and Phobos armour sprue and use that to cover the gap. But first I had to make some slight adjustments that fit nice and flush, hid that hole, but also looked like it actually sat on the model in a more natural way. Once I was happy with how it was fitting, I then glued it to the model. We're getting on to the finer details now. The next bit I did was to remove the head of the Librarian in Phobos armour from the sprue. I also removed the necklace that had the Librarian symbol on it, as it kind of got in the way of the arms and the way they were positioned now. It didn't fit properly. However, I kept it aside and used it for something a bit later on. Again, hindsight's a wonderful thing. I really wish I didn't glue the head in place at this point, as I would love to have painted it separately. However, I was a little bit impatient and stuck it down, not thinking what I had to do later on. That was a problem for future Darren. Next up, I carefully and delicately pinned the sword to the hand. That's a lie, I didn't, did I? I just glued it, because I'm an idiot. And then I removed the Librarian symbols from Mephiston's weird 80s collar thing. Don't know what's going on with that, it's a little bit OTT to me, but still, I snipped them off with my clippers as I was going to be using these for the gauntlets of Ezekiel. If I was to do this again, I'd probably leave this step out. It was more of a visual thing because the Ezekiel model does have these symbols on his gauntlets. However, these parts were so finicky and small, I had to cut the back ends of them off and then sand them down so they kind of sit a little bit flush on the gauntlets. They weren't perfect, but I was happy with the end result, just probably wouldn't do it again. Back to a little bit more sanity, I removed the backpack from the Mephiston sprue, tidied it up and stuck it to the model. I don't know if you can quite see there, but as mentioned, I actually used the necklace from the head of the Librarian and Phobos armour, and I stuck it on the belt. It kind of added a little bit more interest down the front there, rather than having it quite bare and empty. I was quite happy with how that worked, and it filled a hole. That's the important thing. Now, I know I said use 3 kits, but I actually used 4. Well, 3 main kits, but I used a 4th one. And the only reason I did that is for a shoulder pad. Don't judge me. I used the right shoulder pad from the Primaris Librarian sprue, as it was pretty much a bang-on match to Ezekiel's right shoulder pad. Once I tidied up that shoulder pad, I then began the process of sticking it to the model. However, there wasn't very many contact points, so what I had to do is go in with my sprue glue and then later on just go around with my standard glue and kind of touch up any contact points that was created once I'd placed it on the model. This was just to ensure that it was secure and it wasn't going to fall off at any point. Do you remember earlier when I said I had a plan for the Blood Angel symbology on the base? I've hidden it. And when I mean I've hidden it, I don't mean I just stuck the model on the top of the base. What I mean is I actually used some Vallejo texture paste and filled in the symbol. Not that you would have seen it anyway, because the model pretty much covers all of it. However, I would know it's there, you would know it's there, and it would just heresy and all that sort of stuff. So I just filled it in with the paste, filed it down a little bit when it dried, stuck the model on, and then filled the rest of the base up with that texture paste as well. Once that had dried, I primed it, painted it, and it left me with this. Once again, I was very happy with how this turned out. And again, I did have some tribulations and struggles, but I pushed on through, and I'm glad I did. I really hope you folks enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could chuck me a subscription, a like and a comment, I'd really appreciate it. If you have any suggestions, please let me know below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye!